There we go. So we have two very important, I don't want to say deaths, but I guess that's not the way to say it. Deaths in this parsha. We have Yaakov who passes away, and we have Yosef who passes away. And both of them, neither of them want to be buried in Egypt. They're both in Egypt. They both pass away in Egypt, and neither of them want to be buried in Egypt. They both want to be buried in their homeland, in the land of Israel. One gets their wish. Eventually, they both get their wish. But one gets their wish right away, and one takes, a little over 100 years for his wish to come true. And we're going to learn something very important about the mindset that we're supposed to have when we're in a place that we're not supposed to be, specifically a comfort zone or an area of unnatural habitat for your soul, or natural existence for where you are really meant to be versus where you currently are. So, on the text of the parsha, we have Yaakov passing away, and he calls over Yosef, who is the viceroy, who's the king, or as close as possible to being the king of Egypt. And he makes him swear that that he's going to bury him in Israel, that he's not going to bury him in Egypt. And Yosef says, let's look at verse number 30. Yosef says, I will do as you ask. And that's not enough for Yaakov. Yaakov says, swear to me. And Yosef swore to him. And then Yaakov blessed him. So Yosef was a pretty trustworthy guy. So why did Yaakov need to have this double promise or this double commitment? He said he's going to do it. I will do as you ask. Why couldn't Yaakov take him at his word? Why did he make him swear? And that's the first question. Now, what we're going to explain according to Chassidus, according to Kabbalah, and according to also basic logic, that the idea of a swear, I don't know how to pronounce this, but the idea of swearing is taking it out of your hands. That when you swear in this instance that you're swearing before God, meaning that it's not up to you anymore. When you promise somebody, or you make a commitment to somebody, so it's your commitment to that other person. And yes, your word is your bond, and you have nothing but your word and so on, but it's still your own. It's still up to you if you want to keep your word or not. But by swearing, you're taking it out of your own hands. It's not up to you anymore. And basically, you have no choice. So that the fifth Chabad Rebbe explains like this. When you take an oath, no obstacle can stop you, and you are compelled to get it done. An oath marshals are concealed in intrinsic power, and once these are activated, nothing can stand in our way. As our sages say, nothing stands in the way of the will. Because at this point, the oath takes the desire or the decision out of our hands. We have no choice but to complete whatever we swore we're going to do. In this case, Yosef swearing that he's going to bury Yaakov in the land of Israel and not leave him in Egypt. Now, there's a deeper meaning to the word shavua, that we don't necessarily have the text over here. We're going to get to it. But if you look at the word shavua, I'm going to point to it here in the Hebrew. The word shavua is made up of five letters. The shin, beis, vav, ayin, hey. Now, these same letters could also make up the word seveya, which mean sustenance or sustain. And we're going to learn, or we're going to see in the text, that before the soul comes down into the body, the angels in front of God make the soul swear that it's going to be righteous and not going to be evil. And what about free choice? And the explanation is that it's not swearing in a sense of commitment. It's the idea of sustaining, giving the soul the power, empowering the soul to be able to be righteous versus the opposite. In this case, Yaakov making Yosef swear wasn't about getting his commitment as much as it was giving him the power and giving him the ability to fulfill his promise, which we're going to see why that was so important in a few minutes. Now, what do we want to get to here? What is our ultimate goal of this class? What are we trying to accomplish by this lesson? We all have goals. We all have things we want to accomplish, and we all have life purpose, life mission. Sometimes those goals are our own that we come up with. Sometimes we change those goals. We have mission statements, or we have visions of where we want to be. As Jewish people, we know that that is not up to us, that God gave us a mission in this world, and that we're here to fulfill what God wants us to fulfill. And that being the case, we are here to fulfill what God wants us to do. Now, what happens if we're in a place or we're in a situation that we cannot do what God wants us to do? So this class is here to tell us how to live and how to exist and how to still accomplish what we're meant to accomplish, even when we don't think we could. That's the message of this class that we're going to see through the story of Yosef and Yaakov. So Yaakov makes Yosef swear. A promise is not good enough. A commitment's not good enough. He has to swear. And once again, as we see over here, it brings out the inner strength and the deep strength of the person to be able to to bring out that even if there's obstacles, you should be able to overcome it. And the Ramban explains here from a very logical point of view what was happening. Yaakov did not suspect his righteous beloved son that he would disobey his father's instructions in his own words. I will do as you ask. He said that very clearly before he asked him to swear. Yaakov asked him for an oath to make it difficult for Paro to refuse. Paro might want to keep Yosef in Egypt and tell him to send Yaakov with his brothers and servants. Or Paro might insist that the prophet Yaakov, who, by the way, ended the famine, be buried in Egypt, bringing honor and merit to Egypt. So how do you disobey the king? Saying that I committed to my father isn't enough. So forcing Yaakov to take an oath would make Paro hesitate because asking someone to betray their oath is wrong. So by saying I took an oath, I'm not disobeying the king. I just took an oath, and in those days, taking an oath was respected, that you cannot break your oath. When I say in those days, obviously in these days, hopefully as well, but in those days it was even more so. Taking an oath, especially to your father, to your dying father, was something that was respected even by a king. So being bound by an oath would also force Yosef to try harder, and this is precisely as it played out, because Paro actually said, I want Yaakov to be buried here, as Rashi points out, that like you swore to your father, and Rashi points out because he said, if you wouldn't have sworn to your father, I would have made you bury him here. So therefore, Yaakov was basically giving him the tools that he needed and the strength that he needed to overcome the obstacles he would face when it came time to bury his father in Israel versus in Egypt. So let's now discuss the second death. Okay, I know there's a question on the screen here, but that's not exactly how I want to frame this. The second death is Yosef. Yosef passes away at the end of the Torah portion. And Yosef also says, I don't want to be buried here. And he tells his children, and by the way, he was the first of the tribes to pass away, the first of the 12 tribes to pass away. And he told his children as well as his brothers, who he saved an entire people. And he tells them, do not leave me here. When it's time to go, I want you to take me with you to the land of Israel. But interestingly, he didn't say, take me now, like his father did. He said, take me when it's time to go. In other words, he accepted the fact that he's going to remain in Egypt as a mummy, as a mummified coffin in Egypt the entire time, which was I think 86 years, if I'm not mistaken. No, it was more. It was not 86 years. It was a little over 100 years that he was basically kept in a coffin in Egypt before he was taken, and then it was, of course, the 40 years before he was buried in the city of Shechem, which is known today as Nablus. So why did Yosef agree to wait when his father clearly demonstrated that he wanted to go right away to Israel? Why couldn't Yosef ask for the same? At that point, the people were still free. He was still the king. He still could have made it his last will and testament that he wanted to be brought to Israel and be buried in Israel. Why did he agree to stay? And that being said, if he agreed to stay, if his body should stay in Egypt with his descendants, with his children and his grandchildren while they're being enslaved, because they obviously knew what's going to happen, why did Yaakov want to leave right away? Why did he want his body taken right away? Why couldn't Yaakov agree to have his body stay in Egypt and be taken with Yosef along with Moses when they left after the plagues? Why was Yaakov insistent that he be buried right away in the land of Israel? And why did Yosef agree to remain in the coffin in Egypt for however many years it was until it was time to go with Moshe? That's the question. What is the difference between these two patriarchs and their death and their desire to be buried in the land of Israel? One was immediate and desired to be immediate, and one was settling, so to speak, that he could be buried after however many years it was until it was time to go. So let's understand something here. Both Yaakov and Yosef were prophets. They were both righteous, and they were both 100% righteous. And they both knew that the exile is coming. To whatever extent they knew it was coming, they knew it was coming. Yaakov for sure knew, because that's the only reason why he agreed to go down into Egypt. They knew God's plan. It was promised to Abraham exactly what would happen. And Yosef also knew. So why do things, okay, before I ask this question, let's read the Zohar. The Zohar is going to ask a question now that's going to really make us question a lot. Rabbi Yossi says, this is from the Zohar, given that Yaakov knew that his children would be subject to the exile in Egypt, why was he not buried there so his merit could shield his children? Why did he want to escape Egypt? Is it not written as a father has compassion for his children? Where was his compassion? Why didn't Yaakov agree to stay in Egypt? Yosef knew that the exile and the slavery is coming, and by staying in Egypt, even though he was in a coffin, by staying in Egypt, he brought hope to the people, knowing that he promised them that when it's time to leave, you're going to take my body with you. In other words, he was the guarantee that we're not here forever. And by the way, on the night of the plague of the death on the firstborn, Moshe's job was he went to the Nile River. Some say he went to the Nile River. Some say he went to the graveyard where all the previous pharaohs were buried, and he basically called out to the coffin of Yosef and said it's time to go. And the coffin rose to the top of the Nile, and in the other case, the coffin started shaking. And the point is that Moshe went and retrieved the coffin of Yosef and they took it with him, and they took the coffin of Yosef with them for the whole 40 years in the desert. So Yosef being in Egypt was a strength and also a shield, a merit for the Jewish people while they were being enslaved. Why couldn't Yaakov add to that merit? And who knows, maybe Yaakov being in Egypt could have actually helped ease the slavery spiritually, because the spirit of his soul being there, being part of his burial, being there, could have actually helped and kind of brought down the spirituality that comes along with a righteous person being buried there, which would have negated some of the pain and suffering of the people. Remember, pain and suffering and evil in this world is due to a lack of spiritual revelation. So the more spiritual revelation there is, the less pain and evil there is. So by Yaakov being buried in Egypt, it negates the possibility for negativity. So why couldn't Yaakov be in Egypt, at least for that amount of time, until it was time to go, just like Yosef was? So the Zohar gives an answer. Before the answer, let's go to Rashi here. I'm sorry, this is the answer, but the answer is what is brought by the Zohar as well. That what was Yaakov's concern? Yaakov said, do not bury me in Egypt, and he gave 3 reasons. What were the 3 reasons? Number 1, its soil will become infested with lice swarming under my body. I don't understand this reason. I tried to look it up and I don't understand it. The second reason is a very famous one, is that when the dead come back to life during the resurrection of the dead, when Mashiach comes, whoever is buried outside of Israel will endure the pain of rolling through the subterranean tunnels to Israel. So basically, when Mashiach comes, it says that everyone's going to be resurrected. However, whoever's buried outside of Israel is going to come through tunnels, because they have to be resurrected in Israel. So they're going to come through tunnels from wherever they're buried to the land of Israel. It says that's one of the reasons why Moshe is buried outside of Israel, because he's going to be the leader of bringing the diaspora into Israel when Mashiach comes. Which, by the way, it's hard to understand, because part of the idea is that Yaakov would be brought with Yosef to be buried when they go into Israel after the 40 years. After the slavery, which is before the resurrection of the dead. So just like Yosef is buried in Shechem, Yaakov could have been buried in the cave of the patriarchs by his descendants 100 years later. And the third reason, this is the reason that's most accepted, is that he was concerned because he was the one credited with stopping the famine. So he was worried they're going to turn his body into a deity. In those days in Egypt, they would mummify the bodies and they would somehow keep it in a certain way. So he was worried they would turn his body into some kind of deity or idol. And he was worried about that. And that's why he didn't want to be buried in Egypt, even for any amount of time, because they didn't want any possibility that he would even for a moment become a deity. Now, the Zohar still has a problem with this. And before we go to the text, the Zohar still has a problem because the Zohar says, and I don't know if we have the text of the Zohar here or not, but the Zohar says, take one for the team. What are you worried about? You're worried about lice. You're worried about a painful tunnel. You're worried about becoming a deity. All those things are painful, but if there's a possibility that you could bring comfort or spiritual comfort or even material comfort to your children throughout their slavery, take one for the team. None of those reasons are enough, should be enough not to be buried in Egypt temporarily to alleviate the suffering of your children during their slavery. As we see, that's what Yosef did. Let's look in the text. Yosef told his brothers, I will die and God will surely remember you. And this is the promise. What does he say? Right away after he says, I'm going to die. Hashem's going to remember his promise and take you from this land that he promised to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. So you're not here forever. This is not your homeland. He's the king of this land. He's living his best life. He's living in a palace. He's living everything right perfectly. But he's telling them that God is going to raise you. He's going to take you out of here. Meaning this is not home. He's going to take you out of here and take you to the land that he promised Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And then Yosef insisted that they'd take an oath from the children of Israel, saying that Hashem will remember you and you shall take my bones out of here too. That when it's time to go, you're going to take me out of here. You're going to bury me in Israel. These are the last few verses of our Torah portion. Not only that, if you look in the Torah portion, the end of the Torah portion, the last three words of the Torah portion, we don't have it here, but the last three words is Vayisem be'arain b'Mitzrayim, that they placed Yosef in the coffin in Egypt. That's the end of the book of Genesis. That is the end of the entire book of Genesis. That's the end of Yosef's story. Is they put him in a coffin in Egypt. And then we all get up, and what do we say in the synagogue? Chazak, chazak, v'nis chazek. Be strong, and be strengthened, because we just completed a book of the Torah, not just a portion, but the entire book of Genesis. So it's a big completion. But the Torah is supposed to end off with positivity. And what does it say? Vayisem be'aron b'Mitzrayim, that they placed him in a coffin in Egypt. So what are we saying about Yosef? So the Rebbe has a whole talk, a separate talk from the one that we're learning now, but the Rebbe has a whole talk explaining that this is actually the greatest compliment the Torah is giving to Yosef, is that Yosef was sacrificing his burial in Israel for however many hundred years it was until it was the Exodus, to let the people know that he's staying there with them, that until now he was their physical provider of sustenance during the famine and afterwards, but now he's going to be there with them spiritually until it's time to go. That he is their spiritual provider and he's not going to abandon them until it's time to go. And that's why the book is ending by letting the children of Israel know that Vayisem be'aron b'Mitzrayim, that Yosef is still there with you. And that's the highest height and praise of Yosef, to say that this is the ultimate leader that stays with his people even during the darkest times. So if that's the case, if Yosef is so, sacrificial, a real leader, stays with his people, is the last to leave, the last man off the ship, why couldn't Yaakov do that? Yaakov was a good man. Why is he running away? That's our question of this parsha, of this talk. Why couldn't Yaakov be that kind of guy? So Rashi tries to answer this question. And he gives a very logical answer. And his answer is like this. Yosef made a very calculated decision. When Yaakov asked me to take him to Israel, I was the viceroy. I could do whatever I want. So I had the authority to bury my father in Israel. So therefore, Yaakov was asking me to do something that was very easy for me to do because I'm the viceroy. But once I die, Yosef is saying about himself, once I die, then my children have no power anymore. So they'll prevent my children from doing the same for me. So therefore, he made them promise that at least take me when you leave, because he didn't want to put them in a situation that would be impossible. That's Rashi's. Remember, Rashi's about the simple explanation. But the problem is that, first of all, Yosef could have easily put it in a written command. And we all know that if a king puts a written command, even after he dies, they have to follow it. And yes, after he died and after everyone else died, all the other tribes, only then did the Egyptians start the slavery. But immediately after he died, they didn't start right away. The slavery didn't start right away. So Yosef could have made it an order that they should allow them to bury him in Israel. And also, nothing happens by accident. And this is the thing that we believe in the Torah, is that we don't just believe there's coincidences. If it happens, it means there's a reason, and it happens on purpose, especially with a tzaddik. And that's what we believe about Yosef as well. And therefore, there has to be a reason for it. And therefore, we have to also understand why Yaakov chose to be buried outside of Israel. So now back to the real reasoning of Yosef. Yosef was buried in Egypt, unlike Yaakov, who was buried in Israel, to empower the Jewish people while still in Egypt to overcome the exile and control it rather than be controlled by it. And this made it possible for them to leave Egypt. That Yosef being buried in Egypt was actually not just the hope, and not just like a symbol, and not just a nice little bonus, but Yosef was actually the reason. Because of his spiritual merits, it was actually the reason why they were able to survive their exile and actually be able to leave Egypt. So Yosef staying in Egypt was actually crucial to their exodus. So what's with Yaakov? So what we're going to say now is very fundamental and powerful. Yaakov was doing the same thing. There's two different aspects of leadership. And we're going to talk for a little bit before we go further, because this is very important to understand. Leadership needs two elements that you cannot negate one of them. Okay? One of them is what we see here from Yosef, somebody who gets down and dirty with their people. Okay? You have a manager, or you have a leader that is, or let's say a commander that fights with their people and is always ready to do the same hard work that their people is, and that's totally fine. But you also need to have a leader, and it can be the same person. There has to be this characteristic in this leader as well, who also knows how to stand above and beyond the status quo and lift everybody up to a higher level, and not just because that's where everyone is, that's where I'm going to go. In other words, if let's say a leader sees their team working on something that they know could be done much better and faster and easier, so just because everybody's working on it doesn't mean you get down on the floor and do exactly what they're doing because that's what you want to do as a leader. You tell them, stop, we're going to do this a much better and easier way. What Yaakov was trying to accomplish is to let Yosef be the leader from below, and Yaakov was going to be the leader from above. Yaakov was going to be the spiritual force pulling his people from above, trying to pull them out of exile. And Yosef was going to be the pushing them out of exile. And what does that mean practically? So I'm going to start with a story in the medieval times. So Jews were not allowed to own land in certain parts of Europe. And what they would do is they would rent land from landowners, and they would have an inn or some kind of whatever business they were allowed to own, allowed to run, and they would rent. And the landowners were allowed to do whatever they wanted to them if they wouldn't pay their rent. It was free for all in terms of laws. So if somebody was behind on their rent, they could arrest them and they could do whatever they want to them. So there was a land. There were many of these types of stories, but this story is actually not true. It's a metaphor. But this family rented a piece of land. They had a little inn, and they couldn't pay their rent, and they were arrested, and they were thrown into a dungeon. and sorry, thrown into a pit. And it was a very big dungeon pit or whatever. And until somebody would ransom them, that's where they would live. They would have food dropped down every day, and that's where they lived. And then there was another family that was dropped down, and another family, and they were just basically stuck there, and nobody until somebody would ransom them. And eventually they were there for many weeks and months and then years eventually. And eventually they had children, or their children grew up and their children got married and they had children to the point that their children were actually born in the dungeon and they grew up in the dungeon. And it was only their grandfather who remembered that there was a whole world out there, but their children, to them, their whole world was the dungeon or was the pit. And the grandfather every day would scream at them and try to remind them that there's a whole world outside of this dungeon. There's a whole great, amazing world. This is just nothing. This is not the world. Whatever you see, whatever you're used to, this is nothing. This is not the world that this is not everything. And metaphor is told to us as a way of the exile, that wherever we are in the world, we have to realize that this is not it. That this is not the ultimate purpose of creation is for the redemption, is for the time of Mashiach, is for the revelation of godliness that's going to happen. That everything that now is compared to that being in that dungeon, that we should not think that this is it. So the Israelites who were born in Egypt into slavery, they needed to have a Yaakov who was the pulling them out of exile in a sense that showing here is where you need to be. Here's where you're coming. You are coming to the land of Israel. You are better than this. This is not home. And a Yosef from below reminding them that you need to take me out with you because this is not home. This is not the place for you. This is not where you're meant to be. Now, how does this play out? So there's two ways. There's two types of spiritual growth or spiritual strength. There's Yaakov and there's Yosef. So Yaakov is so spiritually refined that he doesn't live in exile. Exile doesn't go with him. So he just stays above it. So he can live in Goshen when Yehuda prepares it and he turns it into a house of study. Yosef is so spiritually strong that he's able to transform the exile and he's able to transform Egypt into a holy place. So how does this play out in different ways? So let's see it in the text. Back to the soul that is sworn to before the soul comes to the body, and the soul has to swear to be a righteous person and not an evil person. And remember, what does mashpiyan mean? What does the swearing? What does the oath really mean? It means that it's being given the strength. What Yaakov was trying to do with the oath of making Yosef swear that he's going to bury him in Israel is to give him the strength that you're going to stay in Egypt to be able to elevate the people. I am going to stay above in Israel to give you that strength, to continue giving you that strength so you can be able to elevate the people out of exile. So it's a partnership. It's a leadership partnership. So the Hebrew word shavua and sova, satisfy or satiated, are similar. This indicates that the oath satiates or fills us with strength. We are satisfied or satiated by the empowerment we receive from God through our oath to study Torah and practice mitzvahs. When we eat, we are full and we are physically stronger and happier. The same applies in a spiritual sense. When we take an oath, God fills us with power and we are satiated, empowered from above to overcome the wills of the desires of our animal soul and its sinful temptations. And that's what Yaakov was giving to Yosef to overcome Egypt. Now, the Talmud gives an important example of human behavior, that a human being has a limitation. No matter how holy you are, you always need to have help from the outside. And it gives an example here. So it says, Rabbi Chia fell ill, and Rabbi Yochanan came to visit him and said, "Do you enjoy suffering?" Rabbi Chia replied, "No, I don't. I don't like suffering. And I don't like its reward," meaning I don't like whatever benefits come from whatever that means. In other words, I guess from suffering or the atonement that is achieved through suffering, I don't enjoy that. So Rabbi Yochanan said, "Give me your hand." He gave him his hand, and Rabbi Yochanan cured him. When Rabbi Yochanan fell ill, Rabbi Chanina came to visit him and says, "Do you enjoy suffering?" Rabbi Yochanan said, "I don't like suffering, and I don't like its reward." Rabbi Chanina said, "Give me your hand," and Rabbi Chanina cured him. And the Gemara asked, why didn't Rabbi Yochanan just cure himself? He was able to cure Rabbi Chia. Why couldn't he cure himself? And the Gemara answers that ein chavush materis atzmai, that a person cannot free himself. No matter how holy you are, even if you're a Rabbi Yochanan, you still need someone else to free you. So even though Yosef was this great righteous person, that was able to transform Egypt into a holy place and to be able to be the sustainer of the Jewish people to get through the exile. He needed a Yaakov to sustain him, to strengthen him, that can only be done from outside of Egypt, that can only be done from above Egypt, from someone who does not have any connection to Egypt, someone who's in the land of Israel, to sustain him and empower him to be able to uplift the people and strengthen them and empower them to be able to get through the exile and able to get them out of slavery. So Yaakov saying, I need to go to the land of Israel. I need you to swear to me that you're going to take me to the land of Israel, was Yaakov empowering Yosef to stay in Egypt himself afterwards, even after he dies, to help the people get through the exile. While Yaakov himself was going to be the source of energy to Yosef to be able to do his mission and empowering the people. So here's what it says. Yaakov didn't abandon his children. He went to Israel to pray and empower their future redemption, while Yosef remained in Egypt to guide and inspire them during exile. He wasn't deserting them. He was enabling their future redemption. He was preparing the road for them. He was setting the tone. Here's where you're going to come to. I am the source of your redemption, and I'm making sure that this is where you're going to come to. You know, if you think about it, we all know that Rachel, who was buried on the road, and she became the place that the Jewish people prayed when they were being exiled into Babylonia. So why weren't the other patriarchs or matriarchs buried on the road? For the same reason. And the answer is that for Rachel to be able to sustain and to be able to pray for her children, she needed to have the source of energy from her patriarchs. In other words, from her source. In other words, Yaakov was providing the source of energy from Israel to Yosef through that swearing, through the oath, the shavua of sustaining, and through that, Yosef was able to sustain the people in Egypt while they were going through slavery to be able to merit the Exodus. So Yaakov's presence in Israel anchored his children to a higher identity, helping them access the part of their soul that was untouched in Egypt. It made sure to ensure that they are connected to a higher source, to a higher element, to the source of their soul that can never be contaminated. And Yosef was the one to ensure that that actually plays out. And the Rebbe explains, Yaakov had to transcend Egypt's culture and power. He also needed to bind Yosef with an oath to carry him out to Egypt. And this is how Yaakov lifted and bound Yosef to his level, to be exalted above Egypt. And this is implied by his instructions to Yosef to take him up from Egypt. In turn, this enabled Yosef to channel this transcendence over Egypt to all Jews, so that Hashem's promise to Yaakov, and I will surely lift you, would come true for all Jews. And the people would be lifted from their submission to Egypt. So it was a chain reaction. It was Yaakov to Yosef and Yosef to the rest of the Jewish people. And that can only happen if Yaakov was in the land of Israel. So it's not just a matter of who abandoned, who didn't. Everyone has their role to play. Just like in the righteous, among the righteous, each one had the role to play of what they needed to do, what they needed to accomplish, in order to ensure the viability and the future and the survival of the Jewish people. So too, each of us all have a role to play. And to fulfill that role, we have to have the shvur, we have to have the oath, we have to have the sustaining from our patriarchs, from our tzaddikim, from our righteous, who sustain us and give us the power to go out of our comfort zone, to go out of the places that we think that we might be comfortable. That's not the point of life. The point is to rise above it and remember that we have a Yaakov buried in Israel, that our source stands above the exile, that we're not chained to an exile, we're not stuck, that we have a Yaakov that made sure that we're never ever going to be comfortable in exile, because exile is not our home. Our home is to stand above it and to rise above it and to always remember that our source, that our soul is a part of God, and it stands above the exile and materialism and things that might get in the way of the revelation of our soul. And that our point is to reconnect to that source and reveal the godliness through every mitzvah, through every good deed that we do, and through the Torah study, and to reveal Mashiach and reveal the ultimate godly presence through the coming of Mashiach. So Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Thank you so much for joining, and it should only be good things.